Welcome to our Spotlight interview series, bringing to you the best filmmakers from around the world. I'm your host, Chetna. Today we have with us an all rounder figure from experimental cinema. He's a director, music composer, distributor, and has done cinematography as well. His 2011 documentary, Free Radicals A History of Experimental Film, is still a topic of conversation among people who appreciate experimental cinema. I'm very pleased to welcome Pip Chodorov to our interview today. Hello, Pip. A warm welcome to 72 Dragons.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So, I'd like to begin today's interview by talking about Free Radicals, a history of experimental film. So, this documentary contains some very unique color palettes at the beginning, predominantly featuring blue and purple shades. So, I was not only drawn to your choice of footage, but also to the explanation that you gave for it. To quote from the documentary, these were our home movies until one day my dog peed on them. I thought it looked cool. So, I completely agree with you, Pip. Also, I think, in a sense, this captures the spirit of experimental cinema. So, can you tell us when did you decide to make a documentary about experimental cinema? And could you share some details about your journey in cinema and how it led you to this documentary?
Well, yeah, experimental cinema is sort of my life. And I grew up making short films just for fun on Super 8 and running around with cameras with friends. And eventually I worked in distribution and then moved to Paris to study film theory. But I kept making little films just for myself. And these films eventually got picked up for distribution by an experimental filmmakers cooperative. That's where I met a lot of filmmakers when I was in my early 20s in Paris. I already knew some in New York, but for me, it was just a community and the world I was in. And one day I was at the Cannes Film Festival where I go every year because I have a job with a student program there. And I saw a movie by Wim Wenders called The Soul of a Man. It's about blues singers. And it really inspired me because the first shot, it's a satellite going through space, and there's a voice that says, I died in 1958 without a penny to my name, but now my voice is traveling through the solar system, the voice of American blues music. My name is Big Bill Brunzi. And I thought that this documentary really, it was great because it showed how valuable that music is and those people are, although they were unknown, they were poor, and being in my world with these filmmakers, it's the same. They're not known very much. They're certainly not rich. And for me, they're the groundbreaking guinea pigs of cinema for the whole world, for cinema history. Thought somebody should make, a documentary a little bit like that one that I just saw, but for filmmakers instead of for musicians. It would be perfect. So that's how I got the idea that a movie like that should exist. But I'm a busy person and I didn't have much hope that I would have ever time to make a film like that. But I kept telling people that would be a film to make, wouldn't it? And people kept saying, yeah, you should make it. So finally, actually, a friend of mine found a producer who hired me to make my film. I didn't even look. And this producer makes animation, actually, not experimental film or documentary. This was his first non-animation, and it was his first feature film. He's gone on to make many other feature films, animation. In fact, he won the Oscar for Flow very recently. But this was his first feature film, was my documentary.
I think that's a really interesting way to put it. So, my next question is about your film Charlemagne to Pilza, which explores the relationship between musical dissonance and the perception of flickering colors. Could you talk about your vision and process for this work?
Well, I made this film because a friend of mine named Charlemagne Palestine was coming to Paris to do a concert. I filmed during the concert. I filmed two rolls of Super 8, which is 5 minutes. And I didn't shoot the whole thing continuously. I shot little bits and pieces in my style. And then also, Charlemagne is someone who improvises, but he also has these stuffed animals that he puts around the piano and he goes into a trance with them. He drinks cognac. It's like an environmental performance. So I filmed all these things. And then I put it on the shelf, undeveloped, and I forgot about it. And 2 years later, I think, what do I have to develop? Oh, I can develop these old rolls. I don't know what's on them. And I developed them and I saw, oh, that concert, I remember. What can I do with this footage? It's interesting. I think I recorded the soundtrack, and I was interested at that time in printing on color. And I thought that I could take this footage, which is black and white Super 8, and not 20 minutes like the concert, but only 5 minutes, and I could blow it up to 16, and I could do something with the colors that correspond to the sounds. Because in Charlemagne's concert, he played only diminished fifths, two notes that are dissonant. And these create a lot of harmonics, and that's what he's interested in. He doesn't play melodies. He plays clusters of notes that create frequencies and harmonics and things that resonate, and they're not that comfortable to hear. Well, I was thinking at that time about the relationship between music and image and color. So I was thinking, well, if Charlemagne is going really fast between these two notes that create all these resonances, what would happen if I flicker really fast between these two colors that can't be resolved in the brain? What would we see? What would it look like? So I set out to make film which I would explore visually what he's doing to our ears with the music. And he plays very slowly at first, but he speeds up, sometimes even faster than 24 notes a second. So in that case, the film becomes a flicker film. And it's a very percussive, very physical experience to watch this film in this flickering color. Some people who have epilepsy can't watch this film. But I was interested in the effect. So, physicality of sound and of light. My idea was you could maybe give an orgasm to the optic nerve. There are all kinds of ideas in this film.
That's really interesting. I think most of us wouldn't have thought about it that way. So, Peter Kuberka once designed an invisible cinema at Anthology Film Archives, where individual seats were isolated by visual barriers. You know, the kind of seating where viewers can't see the people in front of them. But what is your take on experiencing a film in that kind of space? Personally, is there any particular kind of space that you prefer for watching an experimental film?
I prefer, I mean, any space is okay as long as the image is clear and it's dark. But the important thing for me is that it's projected on the format that it was shot on or that it was meant to be projected on. So for Peter, it goes deeper into the idea that this theater is like a cathedral for cinema and that nothing is to bother you, that that's like a godlike being that you give yourself over to the image. There's no other light, there's no people, it's just you and the screen. I never was in that theater. I know people who were in it, and I think it was an interesting experience. Although it's a social experience usually, and in this case, you can't really be with other people. Although I have a friend who picked up a girl in that theater because they couldn't see each other. It was more interesting, maybe, not know who you're picking up. But in any case, what I think is important is the original format. And if a film was shot on Super 8, I think it's better to watch it on Super 8. It's just like if a painter makes painting with oil or acrylic or watercolor, you know, that's what you're going to see. And Super 8 is more when I run around outside or I would just want to put a camera in my bag before I go out. I carry a Super 8 because it's lighter. I have to say the Super 8 cameras are really easy to use. They have a lot of features. Everything is automated. I mean, you have automatic exposure and power zoom and zoom lenses. And Super 8 is for playing around and for doing more like spontaneous and gestural filmmaking. And if you watch a film digitally that was shot on film, it's like seeing a reproduction, like going to a museum to see the Mona Lisa and there's a photocopy instead, you would be pretty upset, right? But people go to the movies expecting to see a film and they see a digital, they're not upset. They don't even know what they're looking at. And for me, that's really important because the film projector has a different physical quality than the digital projector. First of all, it flickers. There's a shutter that cuts the light off while the film transports from one frame to the next. And when the shutter is closed, there's no light on the screen. And when the shutter opens, the next frame is there. And that happens 24 times a second. And that creates in the brain something called the phi phenomenon. It's a bit like when you see two lights blinking. The experience is not two separate lights, but one light moving. And that was discovered in 1932 by Max Wertheimer, the Gestalt psychologist. This perceptual phenomena is fascinating because we don't know why it exists. I mean, there's no reason why the organism, the animal, developed this faculty to interpret flickering light as motion. And the flicker is actually a very, very strong perception, a very strong feeling. And I know that all my films depend on that perception. And so it's important to see it on a projector that has a physical shutter that flickers. And in general, I think respecting the original format is very, very important. And I know that most filmmakers, when they think of how they want to show their film, they imagine a nice big screen, comfortable seats, the light goes down, the curtain opens, maybe a red curtain, and then the film starts. You know, it's an experience with a beginning and end. You're immersed in that film, and it's a very strong experience. And by the way, very, very different from a gallery experience where the lights are on and you can walk in or out. You don't know if it's the beginning or the end. It's a loop, and you can see it from different angles. Where the viewer decides how to watch it. In a film, the film takes you over. It's a different experience.
Great. So, Pip, you've previously compared the experience of watching an experimental film to that of reading poetry. So, could you expand on that idea, particularly in terms of experimental film as a non narrative, non documentary form of expression through film?
Poetry, yeah, I mean, when you're making a fiction film with characters and actors and stories, it's kind of like writing a novel. You're telling a story. But film is not very good at that. I mean, film is much better at other things because there's so much going on. There's so much light and color and texture. Telling stories is beside the point. There's so much more you can do, right? So, a lot of filmmakers got excited by the material, either the actual film material, the chemical processes, the physical effects, the psychological effects of watching it, or they're interested in the cameras or the projectors. And sometimes they even use more than one projector and project on all the walls or make expanded cinema or some kind of performances. You can scratch on the film, you can do anything. So that's more like poetry in the sense that you're playing with the medium. I remember when I interviewed Stan Brakhage, he made it. If you read a poem like you're trying to read a novel, it's very difficult. And way to watch his films are to relax and let them wash over you and feel their textures and feel their rhythms and understand them not narratively, but as a poem. And not to analyze it like a story, but to understand it as a proposal, a proposition in time and space. I mean, every filmmaker wants to do something that's new, and there's no reason to repeat something that's already been done. So in Hollywood film, the idea of Hollywood producers is if something made money, let's make it again. But experimental filmmakers would never make the same thing again because it's been done. What you want to do is be as different as possible from everyone else. And just like in poetry, every poem has a different strategy, a different feeling, a different meaning, a different way of approaching language. It's like a different language. And it's about not wanting to control the viewer, but letting the viewer get what they can from the experience. The viewer accepts it, tries to understand something that's happening there in the film, and hopefully the film creates an experience that has some meaning behind it and something interesting that doesn't have to do with storytelling. So yeah, that's how it's poetic in many, many ways. Its form, its structure, and the way it's appreciated by the maker and by the audience.
So, Pip, you founded the distribution company, Revo Video. You've also previously been associated with various distribution companies, including Orion Classics and Lightcone. So, as a person closely associated with film distribution, how do you evaluate the current situation of distribution in the experimental cinema scene? And do you have any suggestions?
Right now, there are a lot of cooperatives. You know, the cooperative started in early 60s in New York. The first cooperative was started in 61 or 62 by Jonas Mekas. At that time, he gathered around him about 25 New York filmmakers to say that nobody cares about our films. Nobody wants to watch our films. Nobody shows them. At that time in America, the theaters were owned by distribution companies and they showed their own films. You couldn't just walk into a theater with an independent film. You had to have a distributor, and they weren't commercial films that made money. So they said, we have to start our own distribution cooperative. And he started also micro cinemas and things. So all of this grassroots, community-based, nonprofit activity to show the films means it's not really an economy, it's more of an ecology where the filmmakers group together to help each other make their films and show their films and distribute their films. That was in 62, but already just after that, in 66, the same cooperative system started in San Francisco, Canyon Cinema, which still both New York Filmmakers Cooperative and Canyon Cinema still operate. And then in 67 in London, the London Filmmakers Cooperative started. And in 1970, the Paris, it's called the Collectif Jeune Cinema started. And then in Berlin, Toronto, Tokyo. So there are cooperatives all over the world that still work, that still distribute films on film. And there are still places that rent the films. I just rented a couple of films from Lightcone for a screening in Korea. In South Korea. And I started my company, which is a video distribution label, when I was working at Lightcone, because at that time in the early 90s, VHS tapes had just become more standard. But at Lightcone, the programmers of festivals and microcinemas would come in and ask to preview a film and watch a film and decide what to rent. And that means we strung the film up on the projector and showed it. But every time you show a film, it gets scratched maybe or damaged. So we started asking filmmakers, if they have VHS tapes, why don't you put some here so we can show them to the programmers instead of the films. And some people agreed, some people were against it because it looked so bad. And one person who happened to be the rights holder to a very important filmmaker named Maya Deren misunderstood my question and said, yes, you should publish the films on video, on VHS. So then I turned to my colleagues and said, we should actually. And they said, well, it's not really interesting for us, but if you want to, we support that, we can do that. And in fact, at Orion Classics and UGC, where I'd worked before, these companies distributed films to theaters, but they also also had home video labels. So I thought it's natural that Lightcone has Lightcone Video, and we start a video label. And we did, but after a couple of years, they were a little bit down on the idea. They said, you're using our name and we're not really interested in this project. So what happened is I separated it out. I changed the name to Revoir. Revoir is an interesting name. It's a kind of a pun. It means three things. It means to see again in French, revoir, but it has a colon in the middle, which is like in the body of in the subject line of an email. If you have re colon, it means about, it means regarding. So it's about vision. It's about how filmmakers see. And so, I'm against, as I said, projecting films when it's not their original format. But there are a lot of places in the world where you cannot see these films on 16 millimeter, maybe India, for example. The only way to see these films is to see them digitally. So now it's called Revoir because you should see it first on film and then you can watch it again on my label. And at least you've seen it, the real thing, you know? But yeah, I think it's valuable to make them accessible to people that can't otherwise find them in the hopes that eventually they'll be able to see them in real life, the way you might discover paintings in a book and then travel to the museum to see them in real life.
Coming to my last question of the day, experimental cinema, we find, often exists in a kind of space between the art market and the film industry. So, Pip, could you talk about this no man's land and how grassroots movements have contributed to the evolution of the avant garde?
Filmmakers were a little bit, what do you call it? The museums did not want to buy films back in the 50s and 60s. They would show films sometimes, like Museum of Modern Art, but they would never collect a film like you would collect a painting, because a painting will go up in value, whereas a film, if you show the film, it gets scratched and it doesn't last forever, and you can't watch it without projecting it. So it's a conundrum for filmmakers that their work is not valued as an art form, but as entertainment, you see. And whereas in the 60s, when video came out, the early video artists like Nam June Paik and Bill Viola and Gary Hill very quickly realized that the museums would show their installations and collect their videos. So those artists became part of the art market, and they became collectible, and they became quite rich and famous, although it took time. I would say that Nam June Paik struggled most of his life and ate very poor food until the Whitney gave him a retrospective. But in general, the video artists became real artists and the film artists stayed in their corner, right? And so they created their own distribution cooperatives, they created their own cinemas, they created everything. Even labs, we have now a network of independent labs that started back in the 90s, but in fact, recently, in the past 15, 20 years, since digital took over the commercial film production and film exhibition industries, our labs, our nonprofit, do-it-yourself, artist-run film labs have been able to gather a lot of big printing machines, developing machines that we would never have been able to get our hands on before. And so all this technology is now back with the artists, and it's a community and it's grassroots. And as I said, it's an ecology more than any economy, because we don't live on these things, but we live to make films and to show films and to watch films. So the art market really is based on objects that go up in value. And the only way that filmmakers can do that is to artificially limit their prints, like to make 5 prints, to number them and sign them, and to make a certificate of authenticity. And when I remember once Ken Jacobs asked me, he said the Pompidou Center wanted to buy a new print of one of his films that got damaged, and how much should he charge them? And I said, well, usually they pay 4 times the cost of the print, which is peanuts. But you know what you could do, Ken? You could make a limited edition of internegatives, make like 5, and you could number them and sign them, and you could sell it for like $20,000. And he looked at me and said, that's art world bullshit. So I think that a lot of these artists just don't believe in that logic, that you have to make something artificially rare, because filmmakers, they make prints in order that the films can go everywhere. And the irony is that digital can go everywhere. You can make 1,000 DVDs, or you can put things on YouTube and they go everywhere, right? And yet you sign a DVD and you're the artist, you sign 5 of them and sell them for $40,000, and that's normal. So whereas every film print is a bit different. I mean, these are the problems that the filmmakers are in. So yeah, it's a no man's land, because the filmmakers are not in the art industry. They're not in the art market, right? They can't sell their films to museums or collectors. And at the same time, they're not in the film industry, because they don't make box office for the big companies that run the film industry. And for that reason, they're in this no man's land where they're completely in their own communities, and there's no dynamic about how rich and famous you are, or which films won the best festivals prizes and all that. I mean, there's some of that for fun, but it's really not the same. But this is a very rich no man's land. It's a no man's land where a lot can happen. And as I said, said, we have our own cinemas, our own labs, and our own networks. And it's like a community of friends and of people who end up being colleagues. A lot of times we invite each other. I invite filmmakers to show their films in a festival or to distribute their films, and then they invite me to show their film. Or it's a natural process. I think that's the magic thing about film is it's a thing you discover and that you make your own, and that everyone makes their own, and and the community is full of people that have their own way into it and their own approach, and yeah, it's amazing.
This was a really insightful conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your deep expertise and experience with us, Pip. I hope this knowledge is quite useful for our viewers as well. Once again, thank you for your time and please keep making more movies. Thank
Thank
you.
you.